The transport ship shook as it docked with Harmony Point Space Station. Zara Kethany pressed her face against the small window and looked out at the massive structure floating in space. Her violet eyes grew wide as she saw how big the station was. Thousands of lights twinkled across its surface like stars. This was going to be her new home for the next 2 years. That Zara picked up her single bag and walked toward the exit. Her blue skin seemed to glow softly in the ship's lights. She was nervous about starting at Stellar Academy, but she tried to stay positive. Her mother had told her that education was the key to helping their people rebuild after the war. Valyrians had lost badly to the Draconi Empire 6 months ago. Their peaceful planet was now under Draconi control. Many Valyrian families had scattered across the galaxy, looking for new places to live and work. Zara's parents had used all their savings to send her to this famous school. She stepped off the transport and into the busy station corridor. Aliens of all shapes and sizes walked past her. There were tall, gray beings with long necks, small, furry creatures that walked on 4 legs, large, scaled reptiles that reminded her of the Draconi, who had conquered her world. A floating screen appeared in front of her face. "Welcome to Harmony Point," it said in a mechanical voice. "Please state your name and destination." "Zara Kethany," she said quietly. "I'm going to Stellar Academy." "Follow the blue line on the floor," the screen replied before floating away. Zara looked down and saw a glowing blue line appear on the metal floor. She followed it through the crowded corridors. Other students were walking in the same direction, most of them much taller than her. She tried to make eye contact and smile, but they looked right through her. The academy building was huge. The main entrance had tall glass doors that opened automatically. Inside, the ceiling was so high that Zara had to tip her head back to see the top. Hundreds of students filled the lobby, talking and laughing in groups. Zara walked to the information desk where a robot with multiple arms was helping students. When it was her turn, she gave her name and received a small device that would be her room key and class schedule. "Dormitory Level 7, Room 749, the robot said. "Classes begin tomorrow at 0800 hours. Zara thanked the robot and headed toward the lifts. As she waited for one to arrive, she noticed some students nearby were staring at her. They were whispering to each other and pointing in her direction. "Is that a Valyrian?" one of them asked loudly enough for her to hear. "Yeah, I think so," another replied. "Look at that blue skin. They're the ones who got beaten by the Draconi." "Right? My dad says they're too weak to fight anyone. That's why they lost so badly." Zara's cheeks turned a darker shade of blue. She pretended not to hear them and stepped into the lift when it arrived. The other students got in too, but they moved to the far corner and continued their whispered conversation. When the lift reached level 7, Zara got out quickly. She found her room and pressed her key device against the door. It opened to reveal a small but clean space with 2 beds, 2 desks, and a window that looked out at the stars. Her roommate had already arrived. It was a Centauri girl with pale green skin and silver hair. She looked up from unpacking her clothes and nodded politely at Zara. "Hello," Zara said with a smile. "I'm Zara Kethany. It's nice to meet you." "Lynn Sato," the girl replied. She seemed friendly but distant. "I hope you don't mind. I already picked this bed." "That's fine," Zara said. She put her bag on the other bed and began to unpack. She only had a few changes of clothes and some books. From home. Lynn watched her quietly for a moment. "You're Valyrian, aren't you?" she asked. "Yes," Zara replied, not sure why that mattered. Lynn nodded but didn't say anything else. She finished unpacking and left the room without another word. Zara sat on her bed and looked around the empty room. She was starting to understand that her species' recent defeat had made her an outcast before she even had a chance to prove herself. The next morning, Zara got up early and put on her best dress. It was a simple blue garment that matched her. Skin tone. She wanted to make a good first impression on her classmates and teachers. The dining hall was enormous, with tables that could seat thousands of students. Zara got some food from the serving line and looked around for a place to sit. Every table seemed to be full of students who already knew each other. She finally found an empty spot at a table near the back. As she sat down, the other students at the table got up and moved to different seats. Within minutes, she was sitting alone at a table for 12 people. Zara tried to eat her breakfast, but she had lost her appetite. She could feel eyes watching her from all around the room. Some students were pointing and whispering. Others were making faces and laughing at a table near the front of the room. A group of large, scaled students were watching her with obvious disgust. She recognized them as Draconi, the same species that had conquered her world. The biggest one, with dark green scales and yellow eyes, stood up and walked toward her table. "Well, well," he said in a deep voice. "What do we have here?" A little Valyrian, all alone. The other students in the dining hall went quiet. Everyone was watching now. "I heard your people put up quite a fight," the Draconi continued, grinning to show his sharp teeth. "Oh wait, no they didn't. They surrendered after just 3 days." His friends laughed loudly. Other students began to giggle and whisper. Zara kept her head down and tried to ignore them. Her empathic abilities were picking up waves of amusement and cruelty from the crowd around her. It made her feel sick. "What's wrong?" the Draconi asked. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just as weak as the rest of your pathetic species?" He reached out and flicked her ear with his sharp claw. It didn't hurt physically, but the humiliation was worse than any pain. "Leave her alone, Vex," someone said from across the room. But the voice was quiet and uncertain. Vex laughed. "Why should I? She's just a loser from a loser planet. Her people couldn't even defend their own home." He picked up a piece of food from his plate and dropped it on Zara's head. "Maybe this will help you remember your place," he said. The whole dining hall erupted in laughter. Even some of the teachers who were supervising breakfast were smiling. Zara stood up quickly, her face burning with shame. She left her food on the table and ran toward the exit. Behind her, she could hear Vex calling out more insults and the crowd laughing even louder. She didn't stop running until she reached her dormitory room. Lynn wasn't there, which was probably for the best. Zara threw herself on her bed and cried for the first time since leaving home. Across the dining hall, Jake Martinez had watched the entire scene unfold. He was sitting alone at a small table, eating his breakfast in silence. As a human, he was used to being ignored by the other species. Most of them considered humans to be primitive and barbaric, but what he had just witnessed made his blood boil. He had seen bullying before, back on Earth. He knew what it looked like and how it felt to be the target. The cruelty he had just watched was exactly the same, just with different species involved. Jake finished his breakfast slowly, thinking about what he had seen. The blue-skinned girl had done nothing wrong. She was just trying to eat her meal in peace. But because her people had lost a war, she was being treated like garbage. He thought about his own experiences with bullies, how they had made him feel small and worthless, how no one had ever stood up for him when he needed help the most. As he walked to his first class, Jake made a mental note to learn more about Valyrians. Something told him that the girl he had seen crying was going to need a friend. And maybe, just maybe, he could be that friend. The day was just beginning at Stellar Academy, but already the battle lines had been drawn. On one side were the bullies who believed that might makes right. On the other side was a lonely alien girl who just wanted to learn and make friends. And somewhere in between was a human boy who was starting to realize that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. 2 weeks had passed since Zara's first day at Stellar Academy, and things had only gotten worse. Every morning when she walked to the dining hall, students would whisper and point at her. Some would make rude comments loud enough for her to hear. Others would simply stare and shake their heads in disgust. Vex and his Draconi friends had made bullying Zara into their daily entertainment. They would wait for her outside her classes and block her path in the hallways. Their large, muscular bodies would tower over her small frame, making her feel even more helpless. "Move aside, weakling," Vex would say, pushing her against the wall with his shoulder. "Real warriors are walking here." His friends would laugh and make threatening gestures with their claws. They never actually hurt her physically, but they made sure she knew they could if they wanted to. The fear in her violet eyes seemed to amuse them greatly, but the Draconi weren't her only problem. The Nexari students had found their own ways to make her life miserable. These crystal-like beings were known throughout the galaxy for their incredible intelligence. They considered themselves the smartest species in the universe. Kristex was their leader, a tall being made of what looked like living diamond. His body reflected light in beautiful patterns, but his personality was as cold as ice. He had decided that Valyrians were mentally inferior and shouldn't be allowed in advanced classes. During their shared xenobiology class, Kristex would sabotage Zara's work. He would change the data on her computer when she wasn't looking. He would give her wrong information about assignments and then watch her fail. When she tried to ask questions, he would interrupt her and tell the teacher that she was holding back the more gifted students. "Perhaps the Valyrian would be more comfortable in remedial classes," Kristex would say in his musical voice. "Some species simply aren't equipped for higher learning." The worst part was that some teachers were starting to believe him. Professor Vex had begun looking at Zara with disappointment when she struggled with assignments that had been secretly altered. Other students would nod in agreement when Kristex made his cruel comments. Even the normally peaceful species were avoiding her. The Centauri students, who were known for being kind and fair, would change direction when they saw her coming. Her roommate Lynn had requested a transfer to a different room after just 1 week. "It's nothing personal," Lynn had said while packing her things. "It's just that being around you makes things difficult for me socially." Now Zara had the room to herself, which meant she was alone even more than before. She would lie on her bed at night and listen to the sounds of other students laughing and talking in the hallway. Sometimes she would hear them making jokes about the blue freak or the loser girl. The breaking point came during zero-gravity training class. This was a mandatory course where students learned to move and work in weightless environments. It was held in a large spherical room where artificial gravity could be turned on and off. Zara was actually good at zero-gravity movement. Valyrians had natural grace and balance that helped them adapt quickly to weightless conditions. For the first time since arriving at the academy, she felt confident about something, but Vex and several other students had different plans. During a group exercise, they positioned themselves around Zara while the instructor was helping other students on the far side of the room. In zero gravity, it was easy to push someone without the teacher noticing. "Let's see how well the Valyrian flies," Vex whispered to his friends. They began pushing her back and forth between them like a ball. Each push sent her spinning helplessly through the air. When she tried to grab onto something to stop herself, they would push her hands away. "This is how your fleet looked when we destroyed it," one of the Draconi said, spinning out of control with nowhere to run. Other students began to notice what was happening. Instead of helping, they started recording the incident with their personal devices. Some were laughing and making comments about Valyrian clumsiness. Zara crashed into the padded walls again and again. Her body was getting bruised, but worse than the physical pain was the humiliation. She could feel the cruel amusement radiating from the crowd of students watching her suffer. "Stop," she managed to say between crashes. "Please stop." But her quiet voice was drowned out by the laughter, filling the room. The instructor finally noticed what was happening and turned the gravity back on. Zara fell to the floor hard, landing in a painful heap. Her blue skin was darker in several places, where bruises were forming. "What happened here?" the instructor asked. "The Valyrian lost control," Christek said smoothly. "As I mentioned before, some species lack the coordination for advanced physical training." Several students nodded in agreement. The ones who had been pushing her looked innocent and concerned. "Perhaps she needs remedial training," Vex added with fake worry in his voice. The instructor looked at Zara, who was still sitting on the floor. "Are you injured?" he asked. Zara shook her head, even though everything hurt. She knew that complaining would only make things worse for her. "Very well," the instructor said. "Class dismissed. Zara, please see me after everyone else leaves." As the other students filed out of the room, many of them were still snickering and sharing the videos they had recorded. Zara heard one of them say they were going to post it on the station's social network with the title "Valyrian Fails at Basic Physics." When they were alone, the instructor looked down at her with pity. "Perhaps you should consider transferring to less challenging courses," he said gently. "There's no shame in admitting when something is beyond your abilities." Zara wanted to tell him what had really happened, but she knew he wouldn't believe her. The evidence was already being spread around the station as proof of her incompetence. She nodded silently and left the room. That evening, Zara sat alone in the dining hall picking at her food. Her bruises were hidden under her clothes, but she could feel them throbbing with every movement. Around her, other students were eating and laughing with their friends at a table across the room. She noticed the human boy who was always by himself. He was reading something on a tablet while he ate. She had seen him around the academy, but had never spoken to him. Humans were considered primitive by most species, so he was probably dealing with his own problems. The human looked up from his tablet and their eyes met for a moment. There was something in his expression that she hadn't seen from any other student. It wasn't pity or disgust or amusement. It looked almost like understanding. Jake Martinez had been watching the videos of Zara's humiliation circulate around the station's network. The footage made him sick to his stomach. He had seen bullying before, but this was cruel, even by Earth standards. He had spent the last 2 weeks researching Valyrian culture and history. What he found surprised him. Despite losing their recent war, Valyrians had contributed more to galactic medicine and environmental science than almost any other species. Their empathic abilities made them natural healers and diplomats. The irony wasn't lost on him. The students who were calling Valyrians weak and stupid were benefiting from Valyrian medical discoveries every day. The air purification system on Harmony Point used Valyrian technology. The stress reduction therapy that many students use during exams was developed by Valyrian psychologists, but none of that seemed to matter to his classmates. All they cared about was military strength and political power. Jake closed his tablet and looked at Zara again. She was staring down at her food, completely alone in a room full of people. Her shoulders were hunched as if she was trying to make herself invisible. He thought about his own experiences with bullies back on Earth, how isolated and helpless he had felt. How much it would have meant if just one person had stood up for him. Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. He picked up his tray and walked across the dining hall toward Zara's table. As he got closer, conversations around the room began to quiet down. Other students were staring at him with confusion and curiosity. What was the human doing? Jake sat down across from Zara. She looked up at him with wide, surprised eyes. "Hi," he said simply. "I'm Jake Martinez." "Mind if I sit here?" Zara glanced around the room nervously. Everyone was watching them now. "You don't want to sit with me," she said quietly. "It will only cause problems for you." "Let me worry about that," Jake replied. He took a bite of his food and acted like sitting with her was the most natural thing in the world. For the first time in weeks, Zara wasn't eating alone. She didn't know what to say, so she just sat there trying not to cry from relief. Across the room, Vex was watching them with growing anger. The human was ruining his fun. But more than that, he was challenging the social order that kept species like the Draconi on top. This couldn't be allowed to continue. Jake continued sitting with Zara at lunch every day for the next week. At first she was too nervous to talk much. She kept looking around the dining hall, waiting for someone to tell Jake to leave or for the bullying to get worse. But Jake was patient. He would talk about his classes, ask her simple questions about her homeworld, and share stories about Earth. Slowly, Zara began to relax around him. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked one day. "Everyone else thinks I'm worthless." "Because my people lost the war." Jake put down his fork and looked at her seriously. "Back on Earth, I was bullied too," he said. "Not because of a war, but because I was different. I know how it feels to eat alone and have everyone stare at you like you don't belong." Zara's violet eyes widened. "But you're so confident now." "I learned to be," Jake replied. "But I never forgot what it felt like to have no one stand up for me. I promised myself that if I ever saw someone else going through the same thing, I wouldn't just watch." Their friendship was noticed by everyone in the academy. Some students whispered that the human was as weak as the Valerian. Others wondered if Jake was planning something. But most just thought it was strange that two outcasts had found each other. Vex was getting angrier every day. The sight of Jake and Zara sitting together made his blood boil. He had worked hard to establish himself as the alpha student at the academy. His intimidation tactics kept the weaker species in line and maintained the natural order. But this human was ruining everything. Worse, some other students were starting to question whether the constant bullying was necessary. A few had even nodded politely at Zara when they passed her in the hallways. "We need to do something about this," Vex told his friends. "The human is making us look weak. What do you suggest?" asked Razor, another Draconi with dark red scales. "There's a mandatory assembly tomorrow," Vex said with a cruel smile. "The perfect time to remind everyone where they belong in the hierarchy." The next morning, all students were required to attend the weekly assembly in the main auditorium. It was a massive room with thousands of seats arranged in a circle around a central stage. The academy's principal, a wise old centauri named Elder Sovan, usually gave announcements and speeches about academic excellence. Jake and Zara sat together. In the middle section, Zara seemed more relaxed than usual. Having a friend had helped her confidence grow over the past week. She was even participating more in classes and had stopped flinching every time someone looked at her. Elder Sovan finished his announcements about upcoming exams and cultural events. He was about to dismiss the assembly when Vex stood up from his seat in the front row. "Elder Sovan," Vex called out in his deep voice, "I request permission to address the student body." The old centauri looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, young Vex. Please come to the stage." Vex walked down to the central platform with confidence. His large frame and intimidating presence commanded attention from everyone in the auditorium. Behind him, his Draconi friends were grinning with anticipation. "Fellow students," Vex began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "We are here at Stellar Academy to learn from the best that our civilizations have to offer. We represent the strongest, smartest, and most advanced species in the galaxy." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Many students sat up straighter, proud to be part of such an elite group. "But lately," Vex continued, "I've noticed that some among us have forgotten what it means to maintain standards. Some have chosen to associate with those who don't belong here." His yellow eyes scanned the crowd until they found Zara. She shrank back in her seat, but there was nowhere to hide in the packed auditorium. "The Valerians," Vex said with disgust, "are a defeated people. They couldn't protect their own world from conquest. They surrendered without honor, like cowards. And yet, one of them sits among us, pretending to be our equal." The room went completely silent. Every eye turned to look at Zara. Her blue skin seemed to glow brighter under the intense scrutiny, and her hands began to shake. "Stand up, Valerian," Vex commanded. "Show everyone what a loser looks like." Zara remained frozen in her seat. The weight of thousands of stares was crushing her. She could feel waves of curiosity, amusement, and disgust from the crowd through her empathic abilities. "I said stand up," Vex shouted. Some students began to chant, "Stand up, stand up." Others were laughing and pointing. Even some teachers in the faculty section were watching with interest rather than intervening. Zara slowly began to rise from her seat, her legs shaking. The humiliation was overwhelming. She felt like she was going to be sick, but before she could fully stand, Jake shot up from his chair beside her. "That's enough," he said clearly. His voice wasn't as loud as Vex's, but in the sudden silence that followed, everyone heard him perfectly. The entire auditorium turned to stare at the human who had dared to interrupt. Vex's eyes widened with surprise, and then narrowed with anger. "Excuse me?" he said. Jake stepped into the aisle and began walking down toward the stage. His heart was pounding, but his steps were steady and sure. "I said that's enough," Jake repeated as he reached the central platform. "This isn't a trial. This is just bullying disguised as school spirit." Vex laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the auditorium. "Look at this. The primitive human thinks he can lecture us about standards. Your species has barely discovered space travel. You're even more pathetic than the Valerians." "You're right," Jake said, surprising everyone. "Humans are new to space. We don't have the advanced technology of the Nexiri or the military strength of the Draconi. But we do know something about right and wrong." He turned to face the crowd, his voice growing stronger. "I've spent the last few weeks learning about Valerian culture. Do any of you know that the medical scanner that saved my roommate's life last month was invented by a Valerian scientist? Or that the water purification system keeping us all alive on this station uses Valerian biotechnology?" Murmurs began to spread through the audience. Some students looked confused, as if they had never thought about these things before. "The Valerians didn't lose their war because they were weak," Jake continued. "They lost because they chose to evacuate their civilians. Instead of using them as human shields, they chose to surrender rather than fight a battle that would have killed millions of innocent people. Tell me, how is choosing to save lives instead of your pride a sign of weakness?" Vex's face was turning darker green with rage. "They lost because they're inferior. Survival of the fittest is the law of the universe." "Is it?" Jake asked. He looked around the auditorium, making eye contact with students throughout the crowd. "If that's true, then why are we all here? Why do we have schools and hospitals and art museums? Why do we try to preserve knowledge and culture instead of just fighting over territory?" The room was completely silent now. Even the teachers were listening intently. "The strongest species in the galaxy," Jake said, "aren't the ones who can destroy the most enemies. They're the ones who can create the most good. They're the ones who lift others up instead of tearing them down." He paused and looked directly at Vex. "And they're definitely not the ones who pick on someone just because she's different or because her people made a choice you don't agree with." Vex stepped closer to Jake, using his size to try to intimidate him. "You think you're pretty. Words make you strong, human? Let me show you what real strength looks like." But Jake didn't back down. He stood his ground and met Vex's glare with calm determination. "Real strength," Jake said quietly, "is having the courage to do what's right even when everyone else is watching. Real strength is standing up for someone who can't stand up for herself." He turned back to the crowd. "How many of you have ever been bullied? How many of you wish that just one person would stand up for you when you needed it most?" Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some nodded slightly, remembering their own experiences with being outcasts or targets. "That's all I'm doing," Jake said. I'm standing up for someone who deserves the same respect and kindness that we all want for ourselves." The auditorium remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, a few students began to nod. Some were looking at Zara with different eyes, seeing her as a person rather than just a representative of a defeated species. Vex realized that his plan was backfiring. Instead of humiliating the human and the Valyrian, he had given Jake a platform to challenge everything Vex believed in. "This isn't over," Vex whispered to Jake, his voice full of threat. "No," Jake agreed. "It's not." He walked back up the aisle to where Zara was sitting. She was staring at him with amazement and gratitude. No one had ever defended her like that before. Jake offered her his hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's get out of here." Zara took his hand and stood up. Together, they walked toward the exit while the entire auditorium watched in stunned silence. As they reached the doors, Jake heard something that made him smile. Someone was clapping, then another person joined in. Within seconds, scattered applause was echoing through the auditorium. Not everyone was clapping. Vex and his friends looked furious. Many students still seemed unsure about what they had witnessed. But enough people were showing their support to make it clear that something had changed. Outside the auditorium, Zara turned to Jake with tears in her violet eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "No one has ever done anything." The days following Jake's speech were unlike anything Stellar Academy had ever seen. The student body was divided into clear groups, and tensions were running high throughout the station. Some students approached Jake and Zara with new respect. A quiet Centauri girl named Maya Chun walked up to their table during lunch the next day. She had been watching from afar, but never had the courage to speak up before. "Can I sit with you?" Maya asked nervously. "I've been eating alone since I got here, and after what you said yesterday, I thought maybe we could be friends." Zara smiled warmly and gestured to an empty chair. "Of course, we'd love the company." Maya sat down and looked around the dining hall cautiously. "I have to admit, I'm scared of what others will think about me sitting here." "That's okay," Jake said. "Being scared doesn't make you weak. What makes you weak is letting that fear control your choices." Word spread that a small group was forming around Jake and Zara. By the end of the week, 6 students from different species were sitting together at what other students had started calling the outcast table. There was Maya the Centauri, Pete Johnson, another human who had arrived recently, Lix, a small furry Corvin, and even Siren, a young Nexari who disagreed with Christex's cruel methods. But not everyone was happy about these changes. Vex and his supporters were furious that their control over the school's social hierarchy was being challenged. They began planning new ways to assert their dominance. The bullying didn't stop, but it changed. Instead of targeting just Zara, they now went after anyone who associated with her or Jake. Students who smiled at them in the hallways found their lockers vandalized. Those who sat near them in class had their assignments mysteriously deleted from their computers. Professor Hendricks, who taught interspecies relations, began to notice the tension in his classroom. Vex and his friends would make loud comments whenever Jake or Zara tried to participate in discussions. "Perhaps the humans could enlighten us about primitive diplomatic methods," Vex would say with fake politeness. "I'm sure they have lots of experience with simple negotiations." Christex joined in with his own form of harassment. "The Valyrian's emotional responses are clouding her logical thinking," he would announce during science classes. "This is why some species shouldn't be in advanced courses." But Jake had learned something important during his weeks of research. He started bringing up facts that made the bullies uncomfortable. "Actually," Jake said during one of Professor Hendricks' classes, "the Valyrian peace accords prevented 3 major wars in the past century. Their diplomatic methods saved millions of lives across 12 different star systems." He turned to look at Vex. "How many lives have draconian military tactics saved recently?" The classroom went quiet. Even Professor Hendricks looked interested. In the exchange, Vex's face darkened, but he couldn't think of a good response. Draconi culture was focused on conquest and strength, not on saving lives or preventing wars. These moments were small victories, but they added up. Other students began to see that Jake and Zara weren't helpless targets. They were intelligent, informed, and willing to stand up for themselves and their beliefs. The real change came when Professor Martinez, the Academy's head of cultural studies, made an announcement during one of his lectures. "I've been watching the recent discussions among students about different species and their contributions to galactic society," he said. "I think it would be valuable to have a formal cultural exchange program where students can learn about each other's backgrounds." He looked around the classroom, his eyes stopping on Jake and Zara. Would anyone be interested in organizing such a program? Jake raised his hand immediately. "We'd love to help with that, Professor." "Excellent," Professor Martinez replied. "I'll give you access to the cultural database and the main presentation hall. Let's see what you can put together." The cultural exchange program started small. Jake and Zara worked together to create presentations about their respective species. They focused on positive contributions rather than military achievements or political power. Zara talked about Valyrian art and music, their medical discoveries, and their philosophy of strength through compassion. She explained how her people believed that helping others made everyone stronger, not just the person being helped. Jake presented information about human history, focusing on moments when people had overcome seemingly impossible challenges through cooperation and determination. He talked about human exploration, scientific achievements, and their ability to adapt to new environments. The first presentation was attended by only a dozen students, mostly their friends from the outcast table. But word began to spread about what they were learning. Maya shared stories about Centauri poetry and their advanced understanding of quantum physics. Pete talked about human music and how it had evolved across different cultures and time periods. Even Siren contributed information about Nexari crystalline architecture and their mathematical discoveries. By the third week, the presentations were attracting larger crowds. Students were genuinely curious to learn about species they had only known through stereotypes and political conflicts. But Vex and his supporters were getting more frustrated. Their attempts to maintain control through intimidation were being undermined by knowledge and understanding. "This has to stop," Vex told Christex during a private meeting in an empty classroom. "They're making us look like fools." "I agree," Christex replied, his crystalline body reflecting harsh light. "The other students are starting to question our natural superiority. This is unacceptable. What do you suggest?" asked Razor, who had been listening from the corner. Vex smiled cruelly. "The cultural exchange program is giving them confidence. We need to prove that all their pretty words and friendship don't matter when faced with real challenges." "How do we do that?" Christex asked. "The Academy Games are coming up next month," Vex said. "Students compete in various challenges testing physical ability, intelligence, and teamwork. It's the perfect opportunity to show everyone that the weak species will always lose to the strong ones." The Academy Games were a yearly tradition where students formed teams and competed in different events. There were physical challenges like obstacle courses and zero-gravity racing. There were mental challenges like complex problem-solving and strategic planning. And there were teamwork challenges that required different species to work together. In previous years, the games had been dominated by teams made up of single species. Draconi teams won most physical events. Nexari teams won the intelligence competitions. Centauri teams usually won the cooperation challenges. But this year, Jake had a different idea. "What if we formed a mixed team?" he suggested to his friends. "During lunch, we could show everyone that diversity makes us stronger, not weaker." Zara looked worried. "Are you sure that's a good idea? If we lose badly, it will just prove what they've been saying about us. And if we win," Maya added quietly, It might make things even more dangerous for us. Jake understood their concerns, but he had been thinking about this for weeks. We can't live our whole lives afraid of what bullies might do, he said. Sometimes you have to take a risk to prove a point. He looked around the table at his diverse group of friends. We have advantages that single-species teams don't have. Zara's empathic abilities can help us work together better. Maya's mathematical skills are incredible. Pete's mechanical knowledge could be useful in the building challenges. And Siren knows more about advanced technology than most professors. Slowly, his friends began to nod. The idea was scary, but it was also exciting. Okay, Zara said finally. Let's do it. But we'll need to practice together and learn how to use our different abilities as a team. That's exactly what we'll do. Jake agreed. When they submitted their team application, it caused a sensation throughout the academy. No one had ever formed a team with so many different species before. Some students were curious to see how it would work. Others were already placing bets on how badly they would lose. Vex was delighted when he heard the news. Perfect, he told his friends. They've just given us the chance to humiliate them in front of the entire station. The Academy Games are broadcast throughout the sector. Everyone will see what happens when weak species try to compete with their betters. But Jake and his team were determined to prove him wrong. They began meeting every evening to practice and plan. Each member contributed their unique skills and knowledge to help the team prepare. As the games approached, the tension at Stellar Academy reached a breaking point. Students were choosing sides and placing bets. Teachers were discussing whether the mixed team experiment would succeed or fail spectacularly. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just who won the Academy Games, but what kind of place Stellar Academy would become. Would it remain a school where might makes right and the strong dominate the weak? Or would it transform into a community where differences are celebrated and everyone has value? The answer would be decided in just a few weeks when Jake's diverse team would face off against the best that the Academy had to offer. The whole galaxy would be watching. The day of the Academy Games arrived with great excitement throughout Harmony Point. Students, teachers, and visitors from across the sector had gathered to watch the competitions. The main arena was packed with thousands of spectators, and the events were being broadcast to hundreds of worlds. Jake's team had spent weeks preparing for this moment. They called themselves Unity Squad and wore matching blue uniforms that honored Zara's Valyrian heritage. The team consisted of Jake, Zara, Maya, Pete, Siren, and Lix. Each member brought unique skills that they hoped would work together. Vex had formed his own team, called Apex Predators, with 5 other Draconi students. They were the favorites to win most of the physical competitions. Kristex led a team of Nexari called Superior Intellect that was expected to dominate the mental challenges. The games began with individual skill tests. Each team member had to complete a series of tasks that measured speed, strength, problem-solving, and creativity. As expected, the Draconi excelled at physical tasks, while the Nexari performed brilliantly on intellectual challenges. Unity Squad's members did well in their individual strengths, but they weren't breaking any records. Some spectators began to whisper that the mixed team was already falling behind, but Jake wasn't worried about the individual events. He knew their real advantage would come in the team challenges. The first team event was called Resource Management. Teams were given a broken spaceship simulator and had to work together to repair it using limited supplies. They had 2 hours to get their ship running well enough to complete a virtual mission. Most teams divided the work based on their species' natural abilities. The Draconi used brute force to move heavy components. The Nexari calculated optimal repair sequences. The Centauri focused on smooth coordination between team members. Unity Squad took a different approach. Jake had spent time learning about each teammate's abilities and how they could complement each other. Siren, you analyze the damage and create a repair plan, Jake said. Maya, you calculate the most efficient use of our supplies. Zara, use your empathic abilities to help us stay coordinated and calm under pressure. What about Pete and Lix? Zara asked. Pete knows mechanical systems better than anyone here, Jake replied. And Lix's small size means he can access tight spaces that the rest of us can't reach. As they worked, something remarkable happened. Zara's empathic abilities allowed her to sense when team members were getting frustrated or confused. She could guide them to solutions before problems became serious. Maya's calculations helped them avoid wasting materials that other teams used inefficiently. Siren's advanced knowledge combined with Pete's practical experience created repair solutions that were both elegant and effective. When the time limit ended, Unity Squad's ship was not only functional, but running better than it had before the damage. They completed their virtual mission with the highest efficiency rating of any team. The crowd was surprised. Many had expected the mixed team to fail quickly. Even some of the judges looked impressed. Vex was furious. Lucky guess, he muttered to his teammates. Wait until the real challenges begin. The second team event was a combat simulation where teams had to work together to defeat waves of virtual enemies. This was expected to be dominated by the militaristic species like the Draconi. Again, Unity Squad surprised everyone. Instead of trying to overpower their enemies, they used strategy and coordination. Jake directed overall tactics while Zara used her empathic abilities to predict enemy movements. Maya calculated optimal positioning and resource usage. Pete modified their virtual weapons for maximum effectiveness. Siren analyzed enemy patterns to find weaknesses. Lix used his agility to scout ahead and gather intelligence. Their approach was completely different from other teams, but it worked. They completed the simulation with fewer casualties and less ammunition used than any other team. The crowd was starting to take notice. Unity Squad was now tied for first place overall. The third event was the most challenging yet. Teams had to build a shelter that could protect them from a simulated environmental disaster, then work together to rescue other teams whose shelters had failed. This event was designed to test both engineering skills and willingness to help others under pressure. Many teams focused only on building the strongest shelter for themselves. Unity Squad built a good shelter, but they spent most of their energy preparing rescue equipment and planning how to help others. When the disaster simulation began, they were ready. As other shelters started to fail, Unity Squad immediately went into action. They worked together like a well-trained rescue team, using each member's abilities to save as many other students as possible. Zara could sense where trapped students were located through their emotional distress. Maya calculated the safest rescue routes. Jake coordinated the overall effort, while Pete used his mechanical skills to clear debris. Siren's knowledge helped them avoid dangerous areas, and Lix could reach students in tight spaces. By the end of the event, Unity Squad had saved more students than any other team. Even though their own shelter wasn't the strongest, the crowd was now cheering loudly for the diverse team. Students who had ignored or mocked Jake and Zara were now chanting, "Unity! Unity!" As the scores were announced, Unity Squad was in first place, but the games weren't over yet. The final event was the most important and worth double points. It was called Crisis Response and would test everything the teams had learned. As the teams prepared for the final challenge, an alarm suddenly began blaring throughout the station. Emergency lights flashed red, and a voice came over the communication system. Attention all residents of Harmony Point. We are experiencing a critical failure in the main life support system. All non-essential personnel should report to emergency shelters immediately. The announcement wasn't part of the games. This was a real emergency. Elder Sovan quickly took charge of the situation. All Academy Games activities are suspended, he announced. Students should return to their dormitories and wait for further instructions. But as people began to evacuate the arena, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. The emergency exits were jammed with thousands of panicking people, and the situation was getting dangerous fast. "We can't just wait in our rooms," Jake said to his teammates. "People are going to get hurt in this chaos. What can we do?" Maya asked. "We're just students." Jake looked at his diverse team and realized they had been training for exactly this kind of situation. "We can help organize the evacuation," he said. "We know how to work together under pressure." Without waiting for official permission, Unity Squad moved into action. They split up and positioned themselves at key points throughout the evacuation. Zara used her empathic abilities to calm panicking crowds and identify people who were injured or trapped. Maya quickly calculated the most efficient evacuation patterns and directed traffic flow. Jake coordinated between different areas and made sure no one was left behind. Pete used his mechanical knowledge to fix broken emergency doors and clear blocked passages. Siren accessed the station's computer systems to find alternative routes when main corridors became too crowded. Lix crawled through ventilation systems to check areas that were hard to reach. Other students watched in amazement as the team that had been mocked and bullied just months ago now worked together to save lives. Some began to help, following Unity Squad's example and using their own abilities to assist with the evacuation. Even Vex and his Draconi friends found themselves helping to move heavy debris under Pete's direction. Christex used his analytical abilities to help Maya optimize evacuation routes. The crisis brought out the best in everyone. Species that had been enemies worked side by side. Students who had never spoken to each other before were now depending on each other for survival. After several hours, the life support system was repaired and the emergency was over. No one had been seriously injured, largely because the evacuation had been so well organized. Elder Sovan addressed the entire station community afterward. "Today we faced a real crisis," he said. "And we saw what happens when people work together instead of fighting each other. The students who led our evacuation effort showed us the true meaning of strength and leadership." He looked directly at Unity Squad. "You have demonstrated that diversity is not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be celebrated. You have shown us that the best teams are made up of people who complement each other's abilities, rather than people who are all the same." The crowd erupted in applause that went on for several minutes. Later that evening, as the Academy Games were officially concluded, Unity Squad was declared the winners. But more importantly, something fundamental had changed at Stellar Academy. Students from different species were now sitting together in the dining hall, sharing stories and learning about each other's cultures. The cultural exchange program that had started with just a few presentations was now drawing hundreds of participants. Bullying hadn't disappeared completely, but it was no longer tolerated by the student body. When someone tried to pick on another student, others would step in to help, just like Jake had done for Zara. Vex approached Jake a few days after the games. "I want to apologize," he said quietly. "I was wrong about you and about Zara. What you did during the emergency made me realize that strength isn't a